Hi everyone, welcome back to AP Environmental Science. In today's video, we're going to be talking about impacts of overfishing as well as aquaculture, which is topic 6.4 and 6.3 in your notes. Okay, let's go ahead and get started. All right, so fisheries and fishery collapse. So this is going to be bringing back topics that we talked about really early this year, like literally the second day of school when we did the Tragedy of the Commons lab, which is the one where you guys had to pick up the Fruit Lips with the tape and the straws. So that lab was going over concepts of overfishing, sustainability, bycatch, as well as the BOF hypothesis. And if you don't remember anything about that lab, I do have it if you want it back in order to review for this topic. So let's talk about fisheries and fishery collapse. And a few important things for you guys to kind of know or keep in the back of your mind is, again, while fish might not be a primarily source of protein in your diet, throughout the world and through many different cultures around the world, particularly island nations or nations like Japan, the Philippines, they rely heavily on fish as their primary source of protein to survive because they don't have the land space to build pastures for farm animals like cattle. So that's an important thing to note with all of this. So even though you might not eat fish as a part of your daily life, because I certainly do not, that doesn't mean that this isn't an impactful topic throughout the world for everyone else. All right. So what is a fishery? Fisheries are populations of fish used for commercial fishing. So not every single fish that is in the ocean is something that is one, edible, or two, desirable. Those are two different things. When we think of a fishery, we think of salmon and tuna. Those are the two biggest ones. Red snapper, mahi-mahi, any sort of really white fish that tends to be larger, so you get a maximum yield from it. So salmon and tuna are the two biggest ones. And a fishery collapse is when overfishing causes 90% population decline in a fishery. So overfishing is exactly what it sounds like. You're doing too much of it. As a reminder, the world's oceans are an example of a commons. The tragedy of the commons is when humans overuse a resource to the point where it's depleted. So when you have a population collapse or a fishery collapse, the population may never recover because you have so little biodiversity and individuals left that they might not be able to repopulate. If there's so little fish and they can't find a mate, it's going to cause inbreeding, which is not good for a variety of reasons genetically. So it's an issue when you have your populations decline so low. So because of this, my face is way too big. Damn. Okay. So because of this, when you have such a small percentage left of your population due to overfishing, it's going to decrease the genetic biodiversity of fish populations and species biodiversity of ocean ecosystems. The species are lost from an ecosystem. So remember, each step in the food chain is incredibly important because, that's the transfer and the flow of energy and matter to keep life alive. At the bottom of the food chain, you're going to have plants. Now remember, in aquatic ecosystems, you're going to have algae and phytoplankton, as well as aquatic plants that are going to be your producers. They are going to harness energy from the sun, use carbon dioxide to make sugars and oxygen, and then you now have the flow of energy and matter up the food chain. Now up the food chain, you're going to have the primary consumer next, and they're going to be eating the primary producers. So a lot of these fish can be classified as primary consumers, primary secondary consumers, so on and so forth. Now, if you do have a fishery collapse, there's also going to be a huge economic consequence. Fish are profitable. There are some fish that sell in Japan for 2 million yen, or several hundreds of thousands of US dollars just for one fish. So fish are incredibly expensive. They are very profitable, especially in cultures around the world that use fish or seafood as their primary source of protein. So here's the economic impact of overfishing. From 1975 to 1985, we see that we have this really sharp decline of fish that were bought. Let's see here. Oop, oop. Too much overfishing, sharp decline in the numbers of individuals. Then you're going to have this huge loss of profit because you're overfishing too much. We no longer have enough fish left to sell and for people to eat. So this is, the tragedy of the commons happening in action. There was no incentive or penalty to prevent overfishing from happening from, 1975 to 1985. So let's talk about a few different methods that we use to catch fish. The first one is bottom trawling. This one is especially bad because it involves dragging a very large net along the ocean floor. And on the ocean floor, you have such a wide variety of important life, such as scallops, any bottom dwelling organisms, crabs, lobsters, algae, corals, everything not algae, corals and the algae that live in the corals, the phytoplankton that live in the corals. Those are all things that are going to be incredibly important that are on the bottom of the sea floor. Now, not at the very bottom of the sea floor, but, the ocean has levels. It's not just, shore and then bottom of the ocean. It does have different levels. So bottom trawling is when you are dragging a net along the ocean floor at whatever depth that may be. And it looks something like this. Now, think back, if you guys have seen Finding Nemo, think back to Finding Nemo when Nemo and Dory were caught in that net. That was bottom trawling, using a very big net, dragging it along the ocean floor and catching every single thing in that net, even if that's not your target species. So target species is your desired or your wanted species. Let's say, for example, the desired or target species is tuna, and I'm pretty sure that's what they were trying to catch in Finding Nemo. However, because you're using such a big net and you're trawling it along the ocean floor, you're going to be catching things that are not desirable, and this is called bycatch. So bycatch is unintended species like dolphins, whales, turtles, etc. that are caught in these nets, and they're typically by the time they're pulled up to the surface, they're already dead. So unfortunately, this method of fishing is very harmful to aquatic life and biodiversity solely because it's not trying to specifically select for the target species. Another bad part of this is that the fact that the net is being trawled or dragged along the ocean floor. So as it's being dragged along the ocean floor is made up of sediments and calcium carbonates, which is good for other things, but not when it's mixed up. Typically, there's nothing major that mixes up the ocean floor naturally, maybe earthquakes or, some kind of underwater landslide, but nothing like this happens naturally. So you have this disturbance of sediment, and the amount of sediment in the water will affect how cloudy the water is, and that is something called turbidity. So turbidity of the water is going to impact a lot of things, such as the rate of photosynthesis. If we look here in this picture, this water here is really cloudy and murky because sediments are being stirred up. So you're not going to have sunlight penetrate as far down as it possibly could go, meaning you're going to have lower rates of photosynthesis, lower productivity, which is a problem because, again, plants and producers and algae and so on and so forth, they're at the bottom of the food chain. Also, when you do have these bottom trawling methods, they are destroying the coral reef structures, and coral reefs are some of the most biodiverse places, or at least aquatic places, on our entire planet. So because of this, of course, it's going to decrease biodiversity by killing non-target species and removing coral reef habitats. So this is now a trophic cascade issue. This is pulling it back into some ecology stuff that you might have learned about when you took bio. Think of Yellowstone wolves if you did those lesson series. So as we deplete large predatory fisheries, we move down to smaller fish species. So remember, predators play a huge role in population control of prey, and it's important to keep the prey population in control because prey typically tend to be herbivores, so they're eating the producers. So if you are removing your prey species, you're removing your predator species, you're removing a secondary consumer. Your primary consumer population is going to increase, meaning that your producer population is going to decrease because there's more consumers eating the producers. So this is incredibly important because ecosystems need to stay in balance, and predators they do control the population of prey. So as we deplete large predatory fish, we tend to move down to smaller fish species to catch and to harvest. And this can be a problem, again, for reasons I just mentioned, because every single species has its own niche, its own role in a food chain and an ecosystem. And, nature likes to be balanced, not unbalanced. So when you have a depletion of these smaller fish populations, it's going to limit the fishery recovery and decrease food supply of marine mammals and seabirds. And it's very interesting how we do this. It's like we want these things over here. We want salmon, we want tuna, we want sturgeon, but we can't get any of them. So instead, let's capture their prey. Like, who is making these decisions? They're dumb. Like, yes, we can't find enough of these things because we're overfishing them. So rather than letting their populations rebuild, let's just take what they eat out of the water. Dumb. Like, so dumb. That's dumb. So all of these things on top are now going to suffer in terms of population. And then now look, if we're now bringing down these things, we're going to have an overabundance of zooplankton and phytoplankton, which might not be a bad thing theoretically, but it is because, again, nature likes to stay in balance. Okay, now let's move on to aquaculture. So aquaculture is like a solution to the overfishing issue. And aquaculture is kind of exactly what it sounds like. Aqua means water, and culture is typically harvesting or growing something in like the microbiology world as well as in the environmental world. So what are the benefits to aquaculture and what is it? Well, aquaculture is raising fish or aquatic species in cages or enclosures underwater. It's essentially the same thing as like a grazing area for cows or chickens, except it's aquatic. So you have an area that's sectioned off, kind of like an underground pool, and they will grow and breed target species like fish and salmon. These are like the labels you might see on food where it's like farm raised salmon. That's going to be your salmon caught or your salmon harvested from an aquaculture, whereas wild salmon would be salmon caught from the ocean, okay, not in an aquaculture. So this is great for a few different reasons, but of course it also has negatives and drawbacks. So aquaculture only requires a small amount of water, space, and fuel. It reduces the risk of fishery collapse. Remember, there's a 90%, a fishery collapse is a 90% decline in a fishery, and a fishery is just a target species that you want to capture, like salmon and tuna. It doesn't take up any land space, which is good because we should know from our plant-based versus meat-based diet activity that eating a meat-based diet requires way more land for the cattle to live and also for the grain to grow to feed the cattle. So this isn't taking up any land, which is good because our land space is very limited. And we can grow a lot of things in these aquacultures, and there's several different aquaculture types depending on what you're trying to grow. So a feed aquaculture system or a fin fish, this is where you're going to have finned fish, any fish that has a fin on it. Again, see how it's like kind of like this weird underground pool situation? Essentially, it's like a gate or a net underwater, and the fish live there until they're harvested and killed for human consumption. There's other different ways that we can do this for shellfish, which would be things like clams, scallops. Seaweed is also a really big one, at least maybe not in like American cuisine, but seaweed is a huge cuisine item in several Asian countries. And you also have deposit extractive aquaculture, which is getting invertebrates from down below in the surface, or harvesting and growing invertebrate species. So what are the drawbacks to this? Well, as always, everything in life produces waste. You know, everything, everyone, there's always waste. And when you have this high population of individuals within an aquaculture, within that net, they're going to be pooping. They're going to be expelling waste. That's how the world works. And unfortunately, this can now lead to breakouts of E. coli, bacterial infections, as well as eutrophication. Poop is manure. Poop is filled with nitrogens and phosphorus, which we should know by now causes eutrophication. So that's an associated risk. Also, when you have this high density, you're going to have an increased risk for disease. The closer you are to an individual, the more likely you are to either get or spread a disease to and from one another. COVID, we all isolated because we didn't want to get each other's germs. You have this aquaculture, this really tight net with a bunch of fish in it. They could possibly spread disease very, very, very quickly. This also could introduce non-native species or GMOs to local ecosystems if the captive fish escape. So nothing in life is perfect. Humans are not perfect. We don't design perfect things all the time. So let's say if this aquaculture system, this finned fish net system collapses and you have all of these species in the local waterway that you don't necessarily want there, you might now introduce a predator or a non-native species to cull the population, which could lead to a whole plethora of other issues. And one of the biggest thing is that fish are fed antibiotics, which can contaminate water via their waste. And you might have seen this again on store packaging, especially with chicken, where it's like never raised with antibiotics ever. That's like total BS. But I digress. That's a big thing too. That can contaminate the water via the waste. So overall, there's benefits and drawbacks to aquaculture. It just depends on how much the pros outweigh the cons and vice versa. And that is all for this video. I will see you guys all in the last final videos of this unit. If you have any questions, please let me know. Make sure everything for Unit 6 is done and turned in as soon as possible. This is a very short unit. All we've covered so far is ocean acidification, the coral reef gizmo, and we're going to be doing our bycatch lab if we haven't done that already by the time that you're watching this. So I will see you all when I see you. Have a great day. Bye.